Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 422, and I'm back after a somewhat unplanned 6-week break, but life kind of caught up to me. I had some work to do, shockingly enough, and my wife and I had to plan some social events. And I also got some great news from my urologist at my 1-year post-prostate cancer surgery update, checkup, what have you. And on the strength of that, by the way, guys, if you haven't gotten checked, please get checked. On the strength of that, I went about a block away to the local audiovisual dealership and significantly upgraded my turntable, my main rig. Following that, I engaged in a whole bunch of wheeling and dealing on Facebook Marketplace. Long story short, my main rig here in the listing room has 3 new components out of 4, and there's now a satellite listing room out in my home office which has 2 new components out of 3, and in my next video I'll give a little tour of those changes for those who are interested. Anyway, to the matter at hand, which is to talk about this record, and I'm allowing myself an extra minute in this review to account for that update. This is a record by Don Cherry. It is called Brown Rice in most releases. It was actually put out in 1975 in Italy, first on EMI. This record is woven from the many threads of Don Cherry's career. It has elements of free jazz, as you might expect, but also jazz fusion. It's got some global sounds. It really ties together everything that had happened for him musically in the previous 15 years. Don Cherry was born in Oklahoma City in November 1936, and like a lot of people in Oklahoma, the family moved out to California shortly thereafter. In 1940, they moved to LA and settled in Watts. His dad had gotten a job tending bar at the Plantation Club on Central Avenue, the musical heart of LA. And not only did young Don grow up in that culture, so many of the stars and performers that were associated with that scene lived right there in his neighborhood and were basically familiar figures as he grew up. This includes people like Dexter Gordon, like Wardell Gray, and Sonny Criss. These weren't people that were just coming through town. They lived right there just down the street. His parents were musical, and he'd learned to play the piano at home. At age 14, he was given a trumpet, which he gravitated to instantly. But he soon established a preference for another variant of the trumpet, the pocket cornet, a somewhat unusual variant. He went to Fremont High School, where he rapidly began to allocate more of his attention to playing in jazz bands and attending class. That lands him a stint in reform school, Jacob Riis High School, where he meets another miscreant, the drummer Billy Higgins, with whom he'd have a musical relationship for much of his life. By the early 1950s, young Don, now 16 or 17, was starting to play with serious musicians in LA, at times sitting in with Art Farmer's group on piano. In 1954, he began to mix with even more exalted company. That was the year, of course, that Clifford Brown left New York and came out to LA to join up with Max Roach in their famous quintet. At 17 years old, Don meets Clifford Brown at Eric Dolphy's house, and they establish a bit of a mentor-mentee relationship. But by far the most significant encounter for Don Cherry in the 1950s occurred in 1956 in a record store on East 103rd, where he met a young saxophonist called Ornette Coleman. Coleman made a huge impression on Cherry in terms of his utter devotion to music as a calling and as a lifestyle, and their musical bond was both intense and revolutionary. They were committed, as really no other jazz musicians had yet been, to shaking off the formal, inherited structures of jazz. Their sound was atonal. It was highly unpredictable, and they went well beyond the modal revolution of George Russell and his acolyte Miles Davis. Davis was in the midst of dispensing with chord progressions in favor of modes, but Coleman and Cherry and their closest collaborators Higgins on drums and the bassist Charlie Haden at this point were playing on feel. They formed a quintet with and recorded with the Canadian pianist Paul Bley. When Cherry, Coleman, Haden, and Higgins played as a quartet, they were very focused on further developing Ornette Coleman's own original compositions. The problem was these compositions were pretty out there by 1950s jazz standards. They weren't getting a lot of interest from record labels, and they were not getting a lot of interest from clubs. Anyway, Cherry's got to work, so he takes a group up the West Coast, and he ends up actually in Vancouver in late 57, early 58, where he's learning the music of Lee Konitz and plotting his trip across Canada, and he's going to end up in New York. But as he's just about to leave on this trip, he gets a phone call from Coleman, who says, "I've got a record date with Contemporary Records here in LA." And although it sounds tame to today's ears with its head arrangements and its straight-ahead rhythm section, the record that they made for Contemporary, that first one, Something Else, was arguably the first real beachhead for free jazz. On those first 2 records they made for Contemporary, the vision, particularly that Coleman had, was a little bit watered down. But Coleman and Cherry were not to be denied. In 1959, their move to New York, their startling debut at the Five Spot Club, which upset a lot of people and ruffled a lot of feathers, turned the jazz world on its ear. That's a story I've told elsewhere, but it's only one in a number of fascinating stops that Don Cherry takes in his career. After he has what turns out to be a fairly short-lived split with Coleman, he ends up playing with Sonny Rollins. He plays with Archie Shepp, he plays with Albert Ayler, he plays with John Chikai, and of course he plays with John Coltrane on that record, The Avant-Garde. However, although Cherry's free jazz and avant-garde credentials are impeccable, he was no single-minded Jesuit when it came to free jazz, and in fact, as the 60s wore on, he began to lose faith in the jazz idiom entirely and in the format of the jazz club and the jazz performance. By the late 60s, he'd become one of the earliest exponents of what we might call global fusion, which arguably starts to show up first in his record, I think from 1968, called Eternal Rhythm. His physical location changed too, as he'd fallen in love with a Swedish artist, a woman called Moki, and he moved with her to a little town in southern Sweden called Taggarp, which is not too far from Malmo and just across the water from Copenhagen. He ran a musical workshop with her there for a number of years, and he also traveled widely. He went to Morocco, he went to South Africa, he went to India, and all the way along he was picking up not just musical influences, but also facility on different musical instruments. Now, thinking about Cherry's music in the early 1970s, although it's not as out there as some of the free jazz that he made with Ornette Coleman in their most revolutionary moments, it's not necessarily the most accessible music either. However, every now and then Cherry would get into a zone which, if not mainstream, was far more appealing to a larger audience, and that is certainly true of this record, Brown Rice. This record was made in 1975 at two different recording studios in New York. The first of those was Basement Recording Studio at 112 Green Street in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and the other was the excellently named Grog Kill Studio, which was Carla Bley's studio in Woodstock. The record is produced by a guy called Corrado Bocelli, an Italian music producer, kind of an unusual choice. He worked for EMI in the 1970s. He has some credits for some prog rock artists and for some, straight up Italian singers. He had never worked with Cherry before this, and they never worked together afterwards. However, the results are pretty good. Cherry is on trumpet, he's on acoustic and electric piano, and he does some vocals, and he's joined by his old bandmates from the Coleman days, Billy Higgins on drums and Charlie Haden on bass. The other musicians on here include Frank Lowe on saxophone, Don's wife Moki on tambura, Verna Gillis on vocals, and then three mystery musicians who have no credits whatsoever other than being on this record. On bongos, we have Bunchy Fox, and I gotta say that Bunchy Fox, I just assumed had to be from Jamaica because that's like the most reggae nickname you could ever come up with. But there's no vapor trail from him. I have no idea where he's from. And the same for a guy called Hakeem Jamil, who plays bass on track 3. And the biggest mystery, actually, is a guy called Ricky Cherry on keyboards, presumably a relation or maybe a pseudonym because he plays the same instruments basically as Don plays on the record. And again, this is his only credit. So, a mystery. Side 1 starts with Brown Rice, which is a hypnotic track. It's got a simple, repeated vocal pattern by Verna Gillis, and Don comes in now and then to say things like brown rice and miso in a very kind of mysterious way. It's punctuated with these bursts of percussion, Frank Lowe's overblown tenor sax, a very interesting track and a very trippy track. The larger part of side 1 is given over to the second track, which is called Malcons. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This has got a drone from the tambura, and it features an extended solo by Charlie Haden, which is just really lovely to listen to. And there's a great contrast between the intimate way in which Haden's bass is recorded, and then the heavily reverbed, quite epic sounding playing of Cherry, who sounds like he's playing to a stadium. Side 2 starts with a track called Chenrezig. This track is as close as Cherry gets on this record to threatening suburban sensibilities with his playing, but in general it's fairly mellow stuff. The final track is called Deggy Deggy. It has this rapid bass and wah-wah guitar heavy groove going on, think Shaft, not too far off from that, paired reasonably effectively with Cherry's soaring trumpet. I enjoy this record, but I think it's an imperfect outing. At its best, it brings Charlie Haden's wonderful bass to the fore and puts it in contrast with Cherry's soaring lines on brass. At points, I would say this record falls victim to the neither this nor that failings of 1970s fusion. Now, we've all listened to music which draws from jazz and from rock and from funk, but falls between three stools. It's possible to make jazz funky, but you need more commitment than just having a wah-wah pedal in the mix. But I don't want to overstate the case. That's just a minor quibble. It's a much more cohesive and swinging record, even in its weaker points, than some of the music I can think of that came out of the Mahavishnu Orchestra or Miles's Electric period. All that said, I think this is as good an introduction to Don Cherry's 1970s work as anything, and it's worth it for Charlie Haden's contribution alone. For me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.